The first time Timothy Lawson saw the face on that wanted poster, his hands went cold as creek water in January, and the coffee he had just poured himself spilled across the marshal's desk, without him even noticing it burn his knuckles. It was the autumn of 1878, in the small cattle town of Larkspur Hollow, Wyoming Territory, a place with one main street of packed dirt, a mercantile, a livery, a church with a bell that had cracked 2 winters back and never been replaced, and a marshal's office that smelled of gun oil and stale tobacco. Timothy had ridden in that morning to pick up a marriage license from Marshal Otis Prout, a broad, graying man who had held the peace in Larkspur Hollow for 11 years, and who considered Timothy Lawson one of the steadiest men in the county. In 2 weeks, Timothy was set to marry Myrtle Ralston, the young woman who had come into his life like a spring flood, sudden and overwhelming and impossible to hold back. He had not expected to find her staring back at him from a curling, ink-smudged paper tacked to the corkboard behind the marshal's desk, her name printed in bold block letters above a crude but unmistakable sketch of her face. WANTED, the poster read, Myrtle Ralston. Wanted for armed robbery and conspiracy in the Hollow Creek stage line robbery of June 1876. Reward of $500, dead or alive, offered by Mr. Cyrus Blackwood of Laramie County. Timothy read it 3 times before the words settled into something he could understand, and even then, understanding did not come easy. He had known Myrtle for 8 months. He knew the sound of her laugh when she found something foolish he had said, the way she hummed old hymns while she mended shirts at her sewing table, the careful, patient way she taught the 6 schoolchildren of Larkspur Hollow their letters on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, because the town had no proper schoolteacher, and she had offered without being asked. He knew the small scar above her left eyebrow that she said came from a childhood fall from a hay wagon, and the way she flinched, just slightly, whenever a man raised his voice too quickly, though she always covered it well. He did not know that she was a wanted woman. "Marshal," Timothy said, his voice tighter than he intended, "how long has this been up here?" Otis Prout looked up from the ledger he was writing in, following Timothy's gaze to the board, and his face went through a series of expressions, surprise, then something like pity. "That old thing came in with a rider from Cheyenne about a week back, delivered by a fellow working for Blackwood's outfit. I did not think much of it, Timothy. Woman in the sketch does not look like much of anybody I have ever laid eyes on around here." "It looks like Myrtle," Timothy said. "It looks exactly like Myrtle." Otis set down his pen slowly, and the room went quiet except for the ticking of the marshal's pocket watch on the desk and the distant clang of the blacksmith's hammer down the street. "Now, Timothy, I do not doubt your eyes are good, but you are about to marry that woman in 2 weeks. Are you certain you are not seeing what worry wants you to see?" But Timothy was not a man given to fancy or fright without cause. He had served 4 years with the 2nd Wyoming Cavalry chasing down horse thieves and outlaws before he ever took up ranching, and his eyes had been trained to read faces the way other men read newsprint. There was no mistaking it. The woman on that poster, despite the roughness of the artist's hand, had Myrtle's high cheekbones, the slight tilt of her chin, even the way one eyebrow sat a fraction higher than the other, a detail so particular that no stranger could have guessed at it without having studied her closely. He took the poster down from the board with hands that trembled more than he liked, folded it once, and put it inside his coat. "I am not taking this to hang anybody," he told Otis, when the marshal opened his mouth to protest. "I am taking it because I intend to ask her about it myself, face to face, before I let some rumor or some stranger's claim tear apart what I have built these last 8 months. Otis Prout studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "That is fair, Timothy. That is more than fair. But you ought to know, Blackwood is not a man who puts out rewards for sport. If he wants that woman bad enough to pay $500 for her, dead or alive, There is a story behind it, and you had best hear the whole of it before you decide what you believe." Timothy rode home that afternoon with the poster folded against his chest like a hot coal he could not set down, and the ride from town to his ranch, usually a pleasant 3 miles along the cottonwood-lined creek, felt longer than any journey he had made in years. His ranch sat in a shallow valley beneath a line of red bluffs, a modest spread of 200 acres he had built up over 6 years since leaving the cavalry, with a sturdy log house, a barn, and enough grazing land to run 300 head of cattle come spring. He had built it alone, without a wife, without children, carrying the quiet grief of a man who had once been engaged to a young woman named Sarah Whitcomb back in Missouri, a woman who had died of fever the winter before they were to marry. For years after that, Timothy had told himself he was not the marrying kind, that he had had his chance at love and it had been taken from him, and that a man could build a good enough life with cattle and land and the changing of seasons. Then Myrtle Ralston had stepped off the overland stage in front of the Larkspur Hollow Mercantile on a windy day in February, her carpetbag in one hand and a look of quiet, stubborn determination on her face, and everything Timothy had told himself about being done with love had come apart like morning mist. She had come to town, she said then, looking for honest work, having heard from a cousin of a cousin that Larkspur Hollow needed a seamstress and had no proper schoolteacher. She never spoke much of where she had come from before that, only that it was a small town in Colorado Territory that held nothing left for her, and Timothy, respecting a person's right to their own private griefs, had never pressed her on it. He had helped her carry her trunk from the stage that first day, had noticed the careful, watchful way she looked at every stranger as though gauging whether they meant her harm, and had felt something in his chest ache with the wish to be the kind of man who would never give her cause to look at him that way. Over the following months, he had courted her slowly, respectfully, bringing her wildflowers from the meadow behind his property, sitting with her on the mercantile porch on Sunday afternoons, while she told him about the schoolchildren's progress, walking her home from church suppers with his hat in his hand like a boy of 17 rather than a man of 32. She had been hesitant at first, guarded in a way that spoke of old wounds, but slowly, so slowly he had barely noticed it happening, she had opened to him, laughing more freely, touching his arm when she spoke, telling him one evening beneath the cottonwoods by the creek that she had never expected to find a good man in a place like this, and that she thanked God every day that she had. He had proposed to her in June, on a hillside overlooking his ranch, with the whole valley spread gold and green below them, and she had cried and said yes before he had even finished the words, and he had thought, in that moment, that he understood at last what it meant to be given a second chance at happiness. Now, riding home with a wanted poster bearing her face folded against his heart, he wondered if that second chance had been built on a foundation he did not understand at all. He found her on the porch of the small house near the schoolhouse where she boarded with the widow Higgins, sitting in the fading afternoon light with a basket of mending in her lap, her dark hair loosened from its pins by the wind. She smiled when she saw him coming, that same warm, easy smile that had undone him from the first, and it was that smile, so familiar and so dear to him, that made what he had to do next feel like driving a nail into his own chest. "Timothy," she said, rising to meet him at the porch steps, "you are back early. Did the marshal not have the license ready?" "He had it ready," Timothy said, and something in his voice must have carried the weight he was feeling because her smile faltered and her hand, halfway raised to touch his arm, stopped in the air between them. "What is it? You look as though you have seen a ghost." He drew the folded poster from inside his coat, feeling the paper crinkle against his fingers, and for a long moment he could not make himself hand it to her. Then he did, because he had promised himself on the ride home that he would give her the chance to explain before he let his heart make any judgments, and because 8 months of watching her tend to sick children and mend torn shirts and pray earnestly in the little clapboard church had taught him that whatever else was true, Myrtle Ralston was not a cruel or wicked woman. She unfolded the paper, and Timothy watched her face as she read it, watched the color drain from her cheeks like water from a cracked jug, watched her hand come up to cover her mouth, watched tears well in her eyes before a single word passed between them. "Where did you find this?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "Marshall's office. It came in from Cheyenne about a week ago." He paused, forcing himself to say the rest. "Myrtle, is it you? Tell me true. Is that poster speaking of you?" She did not answer right away. She sank down onto the porch step, the poster still clutched in her trembling hands, and for a long moment she simply stared at the drawing of her own face as though it belonged to a stranger, or to some other version of herself she had tried very hard to leave behind. "Yes," she finally said, so quietly he almost did not hear it over the wind in the cottonwoods. "It is me." Timothy felt the ground shift beneath him, though he did not move an inch. "Then it is true, you robbed a stage line. You conspired with outlaws." "No." Her head snapped up and there was fire in her eyes now, fierce and wounded at once. "No, Timothy, that is not the truth of it, though I understand why the paper would make you think it. Please, sit with me. Let me tell you the whole of it, and then you may judge me as you see fit, though I pray to God you will not judge me as harshly as that piece of paper does." He sat, because whatever fear had gripped him on the ride home had not yet hardened into anything as final as distrust, and because the sight of her tears was a thing he could not bear without wanting to comfort her, even now, even with his whole understanding of her thrown into doubt. "My brother," she began, twisting the poster in her lap until the paper crumpled. "Walter, he is 2 years younger than me, and after our father died of consumption when Walter was 17, he fell in with a bad crowd out of desperation more than wickedness. There was a man, Cyrus Blackwood, the same man who has put this bounty on my head, who ran cattle and freight out of Laramie County, and who also quietly ran men who robbed stage lines and mining payrolls when the opportunity suited him. Walter owed him money, gambling debts mostly, and Blackwood used those debts to pull my brother into his schemes, first as a lookout, then as more." She stopped, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand, and Timothy resisted the urge to reach for her, wanting first to understand. "In June of 1876, I learned that Walter was to take part in a robbery of the Hollow Creek stage line, the very stage that carried the mail and a strongbox of mining payroll through the pass near our home in Colorado. I could not let him do it, Timothy. I could not let him ruin his whole life and likely get himself killed over debts that were never rightly his to begin with. So I rode out to the pass myself, ahead of the robbery, to find him and beg him to turn back before it was too late." "And?" Timothy asked, when she paused too long. "And I found him there with 3 other men, Blackwood's men, already waiting to stop the stage. I begged Walter to come away with me. There was a struggle. One of Blackwood's men, a man named Deke Farrow, struck me and tried to force me onto his horse to keep me from raising an alarm. Walter fought him to protect me, and in the struggle a shot was fired, and the stage driver, hearing it, whipped his team and got the coach past the ambush point before the robbery could even properly begin. Blackwood's men scattered into the hills, furious that their plan had failed, and Walter and I fled on his horse, terrified for our lives. But the poster says you robbed the stage." "The poster is a lie built to cover a worse one," Myrtle said, and her voice had gone hard now, hard in a way Timothy had never heard from her before, a hardness born of old and bitter injury. "Blackwood could not let it be known that his own scheme had failed because of a woman and a boy who loved his sister more than he feared his debts. So he went to the county sheriff, a man in his pocket, and swore that I had been the one to plan the robbery, that I had lured his men into an ambush of my own to steal the payroll for myself, and that when it went wrong, I fled with an accomplice. He had witnesses paid to say they saw me at the scene with a gun in my hand, which was true enough, since I did carry my father's old pistol for protection on the ride out, but everything else was twisted to serve his purposes. It was easier, and cheaper for him to hang the blame on a woman with no money and no standing to fight him than to explain why his own men had been lying in wait to rob a stage in the first place. Timothy sat very still, turning this over in his mind, weighing it against everything he knew of Cyrus Blackwood's reputation, which, now that he considered it, was not a reputation of an honest man. He had heard talk, in passing over the years, of Blackwood's freight outfit being connected to more than one unsolved robbery along the Laramie Road, of ranchers who had crossed him finding their fences cut and their cattle scattered, of a man who wielded money and influence the way other men wielded a Colt revolver, without much regard for who got hurt in the process. "Where is Walter now?" he asked. "I do not know, not exactly. We separated soon after, for our own safety, agreeing it was safer to be apart than together, where we might be recognized as a pair. He wrote to me twice after that, care of a cousin in Denver, telling me he had found work under another name on a ranch somewhere north, in Montana Territory, I believe, though he did not say precisely where, for fear the letters might be read by the wrong eyes. I have not heard from him now in over a year, and I do not know if he is alive or dead, only that he was innocent of any true crime beyond desperation and poor judgment, same as I am innocent of anything beyond trying to save my own brother's life." Tears were falling freely now, and Timothy could see in the set of her shoulders, in the way she held herself even in the midst of this confession, a woman who had carried this weight alone for 2 years, who had built a new life out of the wreckage of an old injustice, and who had likely believed, or at least hoped, that it might never catch up to her here in this small town so far from where it had begun. "Why did you not tell me before?" he asked, and it was not an accusation, only a genuine ache of wanting to understand. "Because I was afraid," she said simply. "Afraid that if you knew, you would see only the word on that poster and not the woman standing before you. Afraid that even if you believed me, the fear of what it might mean for you, marrying a wanted woman, would be enough to send you running, and I could not bear to lose you over a lie that was never mine to begin with. I told myself that if I built a good enough life here, if I loved you well enough and served this town honestly enough, the past would simply stay buried where I left it. I see now that was foolish. I am sorry, Timothy. I am so sorry I did not trust you sooner." Timothy looked at her for a long moment, at the tear tracks on her cheeks, at the trembling of her hands, at the fear in her eyes that he might now stand and walk away from her, and he felt something settle in his chest that was not doubt but resolve. "I believe you," he said. "Timothy, I believe you, Myrtle." He reached out now and took her hands in his, feeling how cold they had gone despite the warmth of the afternoon. "I have known you 8 months. I have watched you with those schoolchildren, patient as any mother could be. I have watched you sit up 3 nights running with the Hendricks boy when he had the fever, refusing to leave his bedside though you were not kin to him at all. I have watched you give half your mending money to the collection plate on Sundays though you have precious little to spare. A woman with a heart like that does not rob stage lines for greed. If you say your brother's life was in danger and you rode out to save him, I believe every word of it. And I believe Cyrus Blackwood is exactly the kind of man who would twist the truth to save his own hide and punish an innocent woman for the trouble of it." The sob that escaped her then was not one of fresh grief, but of relief so total it seemed to shake her whole body, and Timothy pulled her into his arms right there on the porch steps, holding her while she wept against his shoulder, the wanted poster crumpled and forgotten on the boards beside them. "What are we going to do?" she asked at last when her tears had slowed. "Blackwood has put a bounty on me. Someone will come looking, sooner or later, drawn by that money. I cannot simply pretend this poster does not exist." "No," Timothy agreed, stroking her hair back from her face. "We cannot pretend, but we are not going to run either, Myrtle. Running is what got you into this mess of hiding and fear in the first place, and I will not have you spending the rest of your life looking over your shoulder. We are going to fight this together, and we are going to find a way to prove the truth of what happened, and we are going to see Cyrus Blackwood answer for what he has done, not just to you, but to your brother and likely to plenty of other folks besides. How? Her voice was small, uncertain. Blackwood has money and men and the ear of a corrupt sheriff. I have nothing but my word. Your word and mine now standing beside it, Timothy said firmly, and whatever your brother might know if we can find him. And Marshal Prout, who I believe will hear us out fairly if we bring him the truth plain and simple. This is still the territory of Wyoming, Myrtle, not the private kingdom of Cyrus Blackwood, whatever he might believe. There are federal courts, there are honest judges, and there is a whole town here that has come to love you as their teacher and their friend. I do not think you are as alone in this as you fear. She looked up at him then, her eyes still bright with tears but something else beginning to shine through them now, a fragile hope she had perhaps not allowed herself to feel in a very long time. You would do this. Even knowing it might mean danger, might mean Blackwood's men coming here, to Larkspur Hollow, to your own ranch. I would do a great deal more than that for you, Myrtle Ralston, Timothy said, and he meant every word of it. I already lost one woman I loved to a sickness I could not fight no matter how hard I prayed or how much I begged God to spare her. I am not about to lose another to a lie some coward wrote on a piece of paper. We are going to marry as planned, and we are going to clear your name doing it. And if Cyrus Blackwood does not like that, he can answer to me and to the law both. That night, after Timothy had ridden home beneath a sky thick with stars, he sat long at his kitchen table with a lamp burning low, turning the whole situation over in his mind. He thought of writing to the territorial marshal's office in Cheyenne, of trying to track down Myrtle's brother Walter through the cousin in Denver she had mentioned, of the risk of drawing Blackwood's attention more directly to Larkspur Hollow by asking too many questions too loudly. He did not sleep much that night, but what sleep he found was untroubled by doubt, only by the practical worry of a man planning a difficult campaign, for that was how he had begun to think of it, not as a crisis to survive but as a battle to be fought and won. The following morning, Timothy rode into town early and went straight to Marshal Otis Prout's office, finding the older man just settling in with his morning coffee. I need your help, Otis, Timothy said without preamble, and I need your discretion alongside it. He laid out the whole of Myrtle's story as she had told it to him, watching Otis's face carefully for any sign of doubt or judgment, but finding instead a slow, considering nod, the look of a lawman weighing evidence rather than a man rushing to conclusions. I have heard things about Blackwood over the years, Otis admitted when Timothy finished. Nothing I could ever prove, mind you, but enough whispers to make me distrust the man on principle. If what Miss Ralston says is true, and I am inclined to believe it might be, given what little I know of Blackwood's character, then we have got ourselves a genuine injustice to right, not merely a rumor to dismiss. What do we do? Otis rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. First thing is, we do not let that reward poster sit up on my board for every drifter and bounty man who passes through to see. I will take it down. Tell anyone who asks that it has been dealt with. Second thing, we need to get word to the territorial marshal in Cheyenne, a fair man named Marshal Beauregard Tillies, and lay out the situation plain. Ask that any bounty claims against Myrtle be held pending a proper investigation into the original robbery charge. Third, if her brother is truly out there somewhere with knowledge that could clear her name, we ought to try to find him, though that may take some doing and some time. I can write to the cousin in Denver she mentioned, Timothy offered. See if there is any more recent word of Walter's whereabouts. Do that, Otis agreed. And in the meantime, Timothy, you keep a careful eye on your own place and on Miss Ralston's comings and goings in town. $500 is enough to tempt more than a few hardened men into taking a chance on collecting it, law or no law standing in the way. Timothy left the marshal's office with a heavier heart than he had entered it, but also with the beginnings of a plan. And a plan, however uncertain, was better than helpless fear. Over the following 2 weeks, life in Larkspur Hollow continued on its surface much as it always had, the wedding preparations moving forward even as a current of quiet worry ran beneath them. Timothy wrote his letter to the cousin in Denver, a woman named Hattie Sims, and waited with poor patience for any reply. Myrtle continued teaching her small class of schoolchildren, continued her mending work for the town's families, and if the townsfolk noticed a new watchfulness in her eyes, a new habit of glancing toward the road whenever a stranger's horse was heard approaching, most were kind enough not to remark on it. For Larkspur Hollow was the sort of town where people minded their neighbor's business only so far as courtesy allowed. It was on a Thursday afternoon, 12 days before the wedding, that the danger Timothy had feared finally arrived in the form of a lean, weathered man on a tired gray horse, riding into town with the unmistakable look of a bounty hunter about him, a Winchester rifle in a saddle scabbard, and a manner of watching the street that spoke of a man accustomed to sizing up trouble before it found him. Timothy happened to be at the mercantile that day, purchasing nails for a fence repair, when the stranger dismounted in front of the building and tied his horse to the rail. Through the window, Timothy watched the man's eyes move slowly along the street, pausing on the schoolhouse where he could see, through its open windows, Myrtle standing at the front of her small classroom, chalk in hand, teaching her pupils their sums. Something cold settled into Timothy's stomach as he watched the stranger's gaze linger there a moment too long. He stepped out onto the mercantile porch as casually as he could manage. "Afternoon," he said, passing through or looking to stay a spell. The stranger turned, appraising Timothy with the same careful eyes he had used on the street. He was perhaps 40 years old, with a face weathered by sun and wind into deep creases, and a way of standing that suggested a man who had survived more than a few dangerous encounters in his line of work. "Name is Jed Coyle," he said. "I am looking for information on a woman said to be in these parts. Goes by Myrtle Ralston, though she may be using another name now." Timothy kept his face carefully neutral, drawing on every ounce of the composure he had learned during 4 years of cavalry service, where a man's life had sometimes depended on not showing his hand too soon. "Ralston, you say? Cannot say that name rings any bells around here." Coyle's eyes narrowed slightly, and he glanced again toward the schoolhouse. "That's so, because I have got a poster here, put out by a Mr. Cyrus Blackwood of Laramie County, offering $500 for her capture, and word reached me down in Cheyenne that a woman matching her description has been teaching school in this very town for the better part of a year." "Folks talk plenty of nonsense," Timothy said, forcing an easy, almost bored tone into his voice. "You would be surprised how many rumors drift through a small town like this one. Half of them turn out to be about nobody at all." "Maybe so." Coyle did not look convinced, but he also did not press further in that moment, instead turning to lead his tired horse toward the livery, presumably to arrange for its care while he continued his inquiries. "I expect I will look around a spell before I move on. A man does not turn down $500 without being thorough." Timothy watched him go, his heart hammering, and the moment Coyle disappeared into the livery, he crossed the street as quickly as dignity allowed and made his way to the schoolhouse, arriving just as Myrtle was dismissing her pupils for the day. "There is a bounty hunter in town," he said quietly, once the last child had scampered off down the road. "Man named Jed Coyle. He has got Blackwood's poster and he is asking questions." The color drained from Myrtle's face, but to her credit, she did not panic, only nodded slowly, her jaw set with the same quiet determination Timothy had come to admire in her. "Then we had best go see Marshal Prout straight away, before this man decides to take matters into his own hands." They found Otis Prout at his office and explained the situation, and the older marshal's expression darkened considerably. "Jed Coyle," he repeated, tapping his fingers on his desk. "I have heard of him. Not a man known for cruelty, from what I understand, unlike some in that trade, but a man who takes his work seriously and does not scare off easy. We are going to need to handle this carefully." "Should I run?" Myrtle asked, her voice tight with barely controlled fear. Perhaps if I simply left town for a while until this could be sorted out properly. No, Timothy and Otis said almost in unison, and despite the tension of the moment, a small, wry smile passed between the two men. Running will only confirm his suspicions and make you look guilty in the eyes of anyone watching, Otis said. Better we face this head-on. I will speak with Coyle myself, explain that there is a dispute over the legitimacy of that bounty, that we have reason to believe the original charges were falsified, and that I am requesting he hold off on any action until the Territorial Marshal's office can review the matter. Most bounty men, even the hard ones, do not relish the idea of collecting a reward only to have it challenged in federal court later, especially not from a man of my standing in this county. That evening, Otis Prout found Jed Coyle at the town's single saloon, nursing a glass of whiskey with the patient air of a man in no particular hurry, and the two of them spoke long and quietly at a corner table, while Timothy waited anxiously at Myrtle's boarding house, unable to do anything but hold her hand and offer what comfort he could. Otis returned near midnight with news that was neither wholly good nor wholly bad. Coyle is willing to hold off, he reported, but only for 2 weeks, and only because I convinced him there was real doubt about the legitimacy of Blackwood's claim. He says if we cannot produce evidence to clear Miss Ralston's name in that time, he considers himself free to collect the bounty as originally intended, and he made it plain he does not care much for waiting on courts and paperwork when there is money on the table. 2 weeks, Myrtle whispered. That is not much time. It is what we have, Otis said grimly. I would suggest, Timothy, that letter of yours to the cousin in Denver had best bear fruit soon, because 2 weeks is not a great deal of time to track down a man who may be anywhere from Montana to Mexico by now. The reply from Hattie Sims arrived 9 days later, carried by the same stage line that had once brought Myrtle to Larkspur Hollow, and Timothy tore it open on the mercantile porch with fingers that shook from more than just the cold autumn wind. The letter was short, but its contents struck like lightning. Walter Ralston, it said, had written to Hattie not 2 months prior, from a ranch near Miles City in Montana Territory, working under the name Walter Reese to avoid any lingering trouble from his past. He had mentioned, almost in passing, that he still carried with him a letter he had taken from Cyrus Blackwood's own saddlebag during the chaos of that day at Hollow Creek, a letter that, if Hattie understood him correctly, contained instructions from Blackwood to his men detailing the planned robbery in Blackwood's own hand, proof that the scheme had been his from the start, and that Myrtle had been nowhere near planning it. He kept it, Myrtle breathed, when Timothy read her the letter that afternoon at the schoolhouse, tears springing fresh to her eyes, though these were tears of hope rather than grief. All this time, Walter kept that letter. Then we need to get word to him, Timothy said, already turning the logistics over in his mind. Miles City is better than 300 miles from here, and we have only got 5 days left before Coyle's patience runs out. There is no time to write and wait for a reply. Then someone must go, Myrtle said. I will go, Timothy said immediately. Timothy, that is a hard ride even for a fit man alone, and dangerous besides, through country that is not always friendly to a lone traveler. And what of the wedding? What of your ranch? None of that matters if you end up in chains or worse because I was too cautious to act, Timothy said, taking her hands firmly in his. Otis can watch over things here, keep Coyle satisfied a while longer with promises of evidence forthcoming. I will take my fastest horse and ride for Miles City, find your brother, and bring him and that letter back here before Coyle's patience runs dry or die trying. Do not speak of dying, Myrtle said fiercely, gripping his hand so tightly it almost hurt. I have lost enough people I love to speak so easily of death, Timothy Lawson. You will ride carefully, and you will come back to me, because I intend to marry you in this church whether it takes 2 weeks or 2 months to clear my name, and I will not have you throwing your life away on some foolish notion of heroism along the way. Despite the gravity of the moment, Timothy could not help the small smile that touched his lips at her fierce insistence. "I promise to be careful," he said. "But I am going, Myrtle. This is not something I am willing to leave undone." He left before dawn the next morning, riding his best horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Duke that had carried him through 6 winters of ranch work and could be trusted to hold up under hard travel. He carried provisions for a week, his Colt revolver and a Sharps carbine for protection, and the letter from Hattie Sims with Walter's approximate whereabouts tucked safely inside his coat, alongside a letter of his own explaining the situation, in case he should need to send word ahead by telegraph from any town along the route with such facilities. The journey north through Wyoming Territory and into Montana Territory was long and hard, 3 days of riding from dawn until well past dusk, stopping only to rest Duke and himself in brief snatches, passing through small settlements and open rangeland, where the autumn grass had already begun to turn brown and brittle under the season's first frosts. Timothy pushed himself and his horse to the edge of their endurance, driven by the image of Myrtle's face, by the memory of her fierce grip on his hands, by the simple, overwhelming truth that he loved her too much to fail her now. He reached Miles City on the evening of the 3rd day, exhausted, saddle-sore, and half-frozen from a cold rain that had plagued the last 20 miles of his journey, and it took him another full day of careful inquiry, asking after a man named Walter Reese at the local livery, the general store, and finally the sheriff's office, before he found direction to a ranch some 8 miles outside of town, where a young man matching that description had been working as a hired hand since early summer. The ranch owner, a gruff but not unkind man named Amos Kellerman, eyed Timothy with suspicion when he arrived asking after Walter, until Timothy explained as plainly and honestly as he could the situation regarding Walter's sister and the injustice she faced, at which point Kellerman's demeanor softened considerably. "Walter is a good hand," Kellerman said. "Quiet, works hard, never gave me a lick of trouble. He is out mending fence along the north pasture just now. I will send someone to fetch him." Walter Ralston, when he appeared perhaps 20 minutes later, was a tall, lean young man of perhaps 23 years, with his sister's same dark hair and careful, watchful eyes, and the moment Timothy explained who he was and why he had come, all the color drained from Walter's face. "Myrtle," he said, his voice cracking. "Is she safe? Is she hurt?" "Blackwood has not. She is safe for now," Timothy assured him quickly. "But there is a bounty hunter in Larkspur Hollow with orders to collect on Blackwood's reward within days unless we can prove her innocence. Your sister told me about the letter you took from Blackwood's saddlebag that day. If it is what she believes it to be, it may be the only thing that can clear her name once and for all." Walter's hand went immediately to a small tin box he kept in his bunkhouse quarters, and when he retrieved it and opened it before Timothy's eyes, there inside, folded and creased from 2 years of careful keeping, was a letter in Cyrus Blackwood's own handwriting, detailing instructions to 3 named men, including the Deke Pharaoh that Myrtle had mentioned, regarding the planned ambush of the Hollow Creek stage line, the exact date, the exact location, and Blackwood's own signature at the bottom, along with a promise of payment for their services once the payroll strongbox was secured. "I have kept this close as my own heart these 2 years, Walter said, his voice thick with emotion. "I always meant to find a way to use it to clear Myrtle's name, but I did not know how without exposing myself to arrest as well, since I was there that day too, however innocent our intentions." "Then we will clear both your names together," Timothy said firmly. "Marshal Prout back in Larkspur Hollow is an honest man, and I believe if we bring this letter before him and before the territorial marshal in Cheyenne, we can see justice done, not just for Myrtle's sake but for yours as well, Walter. You do not have to hide behind another man's name for the rest of your life." Walter looked at him for a long moment, searching his face as though trying to determine whether such hope could truly be trusted, and then slowly he nodded. "I will come with you," he said. I owe Myrtle that much and more, after all she risked to save me that day. Let me speak with Mr. Kellerman about leaving my post and gather my things. We can be riding within the hour." The ride back to Larkspur Hollow was, if anything, more grueling than the ride north had been. For now they traveled as two men rather than one, pushing their horses hard through the same rough country, sleeping only a few hours each night, driven by the ticking clock of Jed Coyle's patience. They rode through a sudden early snow squall on the second day that left them both half frozen and forced them to seek shelter for several precious hours in an abandoned line shack, a delay that ate cruelly into their remaining time, and Timothy found himself praying, as he had not prayed in years, that they would not arrive too late. They reached Larkspur Hollow on the evening of the 14th day since Timothy's departure, 2 days past the deadline Coyle had given, exhausted, filthy, and half-sick with worry over what they might find. And it was with tremendous relief that Timothy saw Myrtle herself come running from the boarding house, the moment word spread through town that riders were approaching, her face a mixture of joy and terror as she took in the sight of Timothy alive and well, and beside him, a face she had not seen in over 2 years. "Walter," she breathed, and then she was running the last distance between them, throwing her arms around her brother with a sob that seemed to come from somewhere deep and long-held within her, and Timothy dismounted slowly, watching the reunion with tears of his own gathering unbidden in his eyes. "Where is Coyle?" Timothy asked Otis Prout, who had come out from his office at the commotion. "Has he done anything rash while I was away?" "He has been patient, more patient than I expected, truth be told," Otis said. "I told him you had gone to fetch crucial evidence and begged him to wait just a few days more. He agreed, though grudgingly, saying if you did not return with something solid by tomorrow morning, he intended to take Miss Ralston into custody and let the courts sort out the truth of it from there, bounty be damned, since he said he did not fancy the idea of shooting a woman who might well be innocent, but neither did he intend to simply walk away from a legitimate claim without some kind of resolution." "Then let us go find him now," Timothy said. "There is no sense waiting until morning when we have what we need right here." They found Jed Coyle at the saloon once more, and when Timothy laid Blackwood's letter before him on the table, along with Walter's testimony freely given, the bounty hunter read the document with the careful, deliberate attention of a man who took his profession seriously enough to want the truth of a matter more than he wanted easy money. "This is Blackwood's hand?" Coyle asked, looking up at Walter. "I would swear to it before any judge in the territory," Walter said. "I was there. I saw him write similar instructions before to other men for other jobs. That is his signature, plain as day." Coyle set the letter down slowly, and something in his weathered face shifted, a hardness giving way to something more thoughtful. "I have collected bounties on men I knew for certain were guilty," he said, "and I have turned down more than one job over the years when something about the circumstances did not sit right with me. I will tell you plain, Mr. Lawson, Miss Ralston, this letter changes things considerably. I am willing to ride with you all to Cheyenne myself, present this evidence to Marshal Tillys, and let him make the determination official. If Blackwood's claim proves fraudulent, as this letter strongly suggests it is, then I will withdraw any intention of collecting on it, and I will say as much before any court that asks." "You would do that?" Myrtle asked, surprise plain in her voice. Coyle shrugged, though there was something almost gentle beneath his gruff exterior. "Ma'am, I have been doing this work a long time, and I have seen enough real outlaws to know the difference between a hardened criminal and a woman who rode out to save her brother from ruin. If what this letter says is true, you are not the one who ought to be wearing chains in this story. Cyrus Blackwood is." The journey to Cheyenne took another 3 days, with Timothy, Myrtle, Walter, Marshal Otis Prout, and Jed Coyle traveling together, an unlikely company bound by a shared pursuit of justice. And upon their arrival, Marshal Beauregard Tillys, a stern but fair-minded man who had served the territory for over a decade, listened to their full account and examined Blackwood's letter with the careful scrutiny of a man who understood the weight of the decision before him. "This is damning evidence indeed," Tilly said, once he had finished reading and questioning each of them in turn. "I have had my own suspicions about Cyrus Blackwood for some time now, suspicions I lacked sufficient proof to act upon. This letter, along with Mr. Ralston's testimony and Mr. Coyle's willingness to stand as witness to its authenticity, gives me more than enough grounds to issue a warrant for Blackwood's arrest on charges of conspiracy to commit robbery, and to formally clear Miss Ralston's name of any wrongdoing in the matter." The arrest of Cyrus Blackwood, when it came a week later, was carried out without violence, much to Timothy's relief, for he had feared the man might resist with the very kind of armed men who had once lain in wait at Hollow Creek Pass. Instead, Blackwood, confronted with the letter in his own hand and the testimony of multiple witnesses, along with the confession of one of his former men, Deke Farrow, who had turned state's evidence in exchange for leniency in his own sentencing, folded quickly under the weight of the evidence against him. He was taken into federal custody to await trial, and though Timothy and Myrtle would later learn that his trial resulted in a sentence of 15 years in the territorial prison for his crimes, including not only the attempted robbery but several other schemes uncovered in the subsequent investigation, that resolution came well after their own lives had moved forward into brighter days. With Myrtle's name formally cleared by order of Marshal Tilly's, and a notice of exoneration published in the Cheyenne newspaper to ensure no lingering rumor could follow her, the wedding that had been delayed by 3 tumultuous weeks finally proceeded on a crisp, golden afternoon in early October, in the small clapboard church of Larkspur Hollow, with what seemed like the entire town in attendance. Packed into the pews and spilling out onto the church steps to witness the union of the rancher and the schoolteacher whose love had weathered a storm few in that town would ever fully understand. Myrtle wore a simple dress of pale blue that Mrs. Higgins had helped her sew from fabric ordered specially from Cheyenne, her dark hair crowned with a wreath of late-blooming wildflowers gathered that very morning from the meadow behind Timothy's ranch, the same meadow where he had first brought her flowers so many months before. Walter Ralston, his own name now cleared alongside his sister's through Marshal Tilly's official ruling, stood proudly to give her away, his eyes bright with unshed tears as he placed her hand in Timothy's before the whole congregation. The Reverend Josiah Adams, who had presided over the church in Larkspur Hollow for nearly 20 years, spoke words that afternoon about love that endures trial, about faith that outlasts fear, and about the particular grace of finding, in a hard and unforgiving land, a partner willing to stand beside you through whatever storms life might bring. When he pronounced Timothy Lawson and Myrtle Ralston husband and wife, the cheer that went up from the gathered townsfolk could be heard, some said, clear down to the creek at the edge of town. Jed Coyle, who had lingered in Larkspur Hollow through the weeks of investigation and trial preparation, found himself, somewhat to his own surprise, still present for the wedding itself, having developed over those weeks an unexpected fondness for the town and its people, and in particular for the widow Higgins, whose boarding house he had taken a room in, and whose sharp wit and warm hospitality had gradually worn away at the guarded solitude of a man who had spent too many years alone on the trail chasing bounties. It would not be the last anyone in Larkspur Hollow saw of Jed Coyle, for within the year he would return, this time not in pursuit of any reward, but courting a leaner Higgins with the same careful, deliberate attention he had once given to tracking outlaws, and the two would marry the following spring, much to the quiet satisfaction of a town that had come to think well of the weathered bounty hunter who had chosen truth over easy money. Walter Ralston, for his part, chose to remain in Larkspur Hollow rather than return to Montana Territory, taking up work as a hand on Timothy's ranch and eventually, over the following years, saving enough to purchase a modest parcel of land adjoining his brother-in-law's property, where he built his own small house and, in time, married a young woman named Constance Whitfield, the daughter of a neighboring rancher, raising a family of his own within sight of his sister's home. The two families' children growing up together, as close as any cousins could be. As for Timothy and Myrtle, their marriage settled into the rhythms of ranch life, with a happiness that neither had quite dared to hope for during the darkest days of that autumn's ordeal. The ranch prospered under their combined efforts, Timothy managing the cattle and the land with the same steady competence he had always shown, while Myrtle continued teaching the town's children for several more years before the demands of her own growing family drew her attention increasingly homeward. Their first child, a son they named Thomas after Timothy's own father, was born in the late summer of 1879, a robust, dark-haired boy with his mother's watchful eyes and his father's steady temperament, and his arrival was celebrated by the whole town, many of whom had followed the story of his parents' courtship and trial with the kind of investment small communities often develop in the lives of their own. 2 years later came a daughter, Eleanor, named in affectionate tribute to the widow Higgins who had become like family to Myrtle during her years of boarding, and 3 years after that, a second son, Walter, named for the brother whose loyalty and courage had helped save his sister's life and future both. In the evenings, once the children were settled and the ranch chores complete, Timothy and Myrtle would often sit together on the porch of the home they had built, watching the sun set behind the red bluffs that sheltered their valley. And sometimes, in quiet moments, Myrtle would speak of those difficult weeks when her past had threatened to unravel everything she had built, and of her enduring gratitude that Timothy had chosen, in that crucial moment on the porch steps, to believe in her rather than in a piece of paper meant to condemn her. "I think of it sometimes," she told him once, perhaps 5 years into their marriage, as they watched their children playing in the yard beneath a sky streaked orange and purple with the fading light. "How different everything might have been if you had simply believed what that poster said, if you had let fear or doubt turn you away from me before I ever had the chance to explain." "I could never have believed it," Timothy said, drawing her close against his side, feeling the familiar, comforting weight of her head against his shoulder. "Not for one moment, not truly, though I will admit the shock of it struck me hard that first day. But I had watched you too closely, loved you too well already, to let a stranger's lie undo what I knew in my own heart to be true. You were never the woman on that poster, Myrtle. You were only ever the woman who taught our town's children their letters, who sat up nights nursing sick neighbors, who rode out into danger to save her own brother without a thought for her own safety. That is the woman I fell in love with, and that is the woman I married, and no piece of paper, however official it might look, could ever change that truth." Myrtle turned her face up to his then, tears of happiness rather than fear glistening in her eyes, the same eyes that had once looked out from a crude, cruel sketch meant to brand her a criminal, now looking instead at the man who had chosen, against every reasonable fear, to see her clearly and to love her completely. "I love you, Timothy Lawson," she said softly, "more than I ever believed I could love anyone after everything that came before." "And I love you, Myrtle Lawson," he replied, using her married name with a warmth that never failed to make her smile. "I intend to keep on loving you for every day we have left to us, however many years that might be." Their children grew strong and healthy in the years that followed. The ranch expanded to accommodate a growing family and a growing herd, and Larkspur Hollow itself grew alongside them, eventually gaining a proper schoolhouse with a hired teacher to replace the volunteer efforts Myrtle had once provided. Though she continued to help with the town's children whenever she was needed, her reputation as a kind and patient teacher never fading even as her own family responsibilities grew. Cyrus Blackwood served out his sentence in the territorial prison, and upon his eventual release many years later, a broken and much diminished man, he made no attempt to return to Laramie County or to trouble the family whose lives he had once so nearly destroyed, having lost, in the course of his imprisonment, both his fortune and whatever influence he had once wielded. His freight and cattle operations having been seized and sold to satisfy the debts and legal judgments that accumulated against him during his trial and incarceration. Deke Farrow, whose testimony had helped secure Blackwood's conviction, served a much shorter sentence in exchange for his cooperation, and upon his release, he too vanished from the region entirely, seeking, perhaps, to leave behind the shadow of his own past mistakes in some distant territory where his name carried no weight of judgment. Marshal Otis Prout continued to serve as the peacekeeper of Larkspur Hollow for many more years, a fixture of the community as steady and reliable as the bluffs that sheltered the valley, and he took particular pride, in his later years, in telling the story of how Timothy Lawson and Myrtle Ralston had faced down an injustice together, and emerged not only unscathed but stronger for the trial. A story he was fond of sharing with newcomers to the town, as an example of the character that had built Larkspur Hollow into the community it had become. On the 10th anniversary of their wedding, Timothy and Myrtle stood once more before the congregation of that same small clapboard church, this time to renew their vows in a simple ceremony attended by their 3 children, by Walter and his own growing family, by Jed and Alina Coyle, who had become dear friends over the years, and by the whole town that had watched their love story unfold from its uncertain, frightening beginning to its joyful, settled present. 10 years ago, Reverend Adams said in his remarks that day, an older man now, his hair gone fully white, but his voice still carrying the same warmth it always had, I stood before this congregation and spoke of love that endures trial, of faith that outlasts fear. I did not know then just how thoroughly that trial would be tested, nor how completely that faith would be rewarded. Timothy Lawson and Myrtle Ralston have shown this town, in the truest and most lasting way possible, that love built on trust and courage can weather any storm, even one written in the harsh, unforgiving language of a wanted poster. May we all be so fortunate as to find a love so strong and so worth fighting for. As the sun set that evening over the ranch that had become their shared home, over the children who played in its yard and the cattle that grazed its pastures, over the community that had welcomed them both with such generous hearts, Timothy Lawson looked at his wife, at the woman he had once found himself terrified to lose over a lie printed on a curling piece of paper, and felt, as he had felt every day since that terrible, transformative afternoon, the deep and abiding gratitude of a man who had chosen to believe in love over fear, and who had found in that choice the truest happiness he had ever known. No regrets, Myrtle asked him quietly as their children's laughter drifted across the evening air. Not a single one, Timothy answered, drawing her close as the first stars began to appear over the red bluffs of Larkspur Hollow. Not one moment of it, Myrtle. Finding that poster was the hardest thing I ever faced, but choosing you, choosing us, over every doubt it tried to plant in my heart, that was the easiest decision I ever made in my whole life. And there, beneath the wide Wyoming sky, surrounded by the family and community they had built together against every obstacle a cruel and unjust past had tried to place before them, Timothy Lawson and Myrtle Ralston Lawson stood together as they always had since that fateful autumn, hand in hand, hearts fully and completely joined, ready to face whatever years still lay ahead of them together, always together, for as long as they both should live.